Oh, hi everyone. Oh, it's quite loud. Why don't we make a start? I think I recognise. Is that sort of feeding back, or yeah, it's all right. I think I recognise most people from yesterday, so welcome again. And my name's Chris Danter, and I'm Professor of Literature here in the School of Cybernetics. And I wanted to begin, as we always do, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land. So we're meeting on the Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I wanted to pay respects to elders past and present. I want to acknowledge this land as sacred and unceded, living and full of story. So today we've got a little bit of a different beginning, and hopefully we can make it a bit more informal. As I announced yesterday, Cheryl Vint is unfortunately not able to make it as a result of that huge global outage, which is kind of an interesting thing to talk about, isn't it? I don't know why that's feeding back. Right, maybe I need to back away. Yeah, I mean, just a sign of how fragile, this ecosystem we're in is. I had an amazing experience in London where there was an outage, an electrical outage on the street, and the hotel just broke. I mean, the water stopped. The electric heat pumps and I don't know if this is something that's happening more, that we're just more, things are more dependent upon, more fragile or whatever. But yeah, that was Catherine Hales has talked about how if all the computers went down, it would be a kind of apocalypse. And I was thinking before that experience, no. But then when you start to live it, it's quite incredible what can happen. No water, people, in the lobby, not being able to, all those things. But anyway, so what we wanted to do today is have a much more interactive session and talk about, we've sort of begun some really interesting conversations yesterday about, what it means to sort of do literary studies, to do work in the humanities, social sciences in relation to AI and, the change of the landscape that's happening now. And I thought we could have a sort of panel discussion, not just involving the speakers in the conference, but also the audience. So we had an idea of, we'll get some people up and we can talk about these kind of challenges and opportunities in this space. But we really want to involve the audience. So I'm almost seeing this like as a class. So can we have a class around this and take some of what we did yesterday and we can actually, hopefully, we're recording it so we can think of what to do. Can we ask can we make questions more precise? Can we make decisions about what we can potentially do in this space? And we just wanted to hear, because there are people at the conference who sort of have worked in tech with AI, in AI companies before, but also are in literary studies or in a humanities discipline, might be doing creative work, and how can we take the opportunity to have a voice for this kind of work in this space, because we know that there are conversations going on all the time, but people like us in this room are not necessarily included in those conversations, and how can we do that? So that's the sort of idea of this opening session. And what we've done is we've quickly put some questions together that we can use as kind of structuring questions. But I mean, I'd really like it to be freeform so that we can, change, we can go off on any direction. So, I mean, I thought the format might be something like, if we can get people to come up. So we've only got a limited number of chairs. I don't know if we just use these four or we use them all, but I'd love it for people to come up, and then maybe we could talk about where we are in this space. So, what do you do? Like, what's your background? Because we're coming from quite interesting, different backgrounds. And then we can start to address some of these questions. Does that sound okay? Yeah. So, maybe we'll just begin by asking for some volunteers. Who wants to join the hot seat? Yeah, Judith? Yep. Yeah, sure, come up. So please come up and
yeah, Chris, when I got your email about this, I thought it meant I needed to be on the panel, so I was ready to roll.
Yeah, no, that's good for this. So what I thought we'd do, because I've got a microphone, you know, that I can roam around the room with. This is that should be working. So maybe, I mean, I think that the first thing to do, and we might have a couple of these panels, is just if you could quickly introduce yourself and quickly maybe locate yourself in this space of, you know, literary studies, humanities, AI research, and yeah, so we can.
Sure. My name is Bridget Vincent. I'm English, and I'm interested in the way in which literary representations of other minds connects with and dovetails with and perhaps differs from the way we think of artificially intelligent entities as other minds, and all the questions of knowability and unknowability that entails.
I'm Judith Fisher. I'm at La Trobe University, sort of most closely affiliated with linguistics. And I've come from 17.5 years in the language technology industry. So during that time, I've also been a poet. So I'm kind of grappling with these questions personally. And I think one of the questions is probably the second one here is about how do these areas really speak to each other? What do we want to accomplish? Do we want to be speaking with computer scientists and engineers? Do we want them to understand our perspectives and to inform what they do? You know, what are our aspirations in having this conversation, I suppose, is interesting to me.
Wendy Alford. I started off with reading 7 science fiction books when I was a kid one day, and then progressed to doing a doctorate on the future of work and how you can anticipate what's happening. And I came to narrative as the place that you could best do that, as a sort of third space, if you like. But I basically earned my crust doing text analytics on anything that has words in it or can have words in it. And so there's enormous potential, I think, for that intersection between the sort of creative spirit and the knowing, you know, this is how the world turns. So you can work out what story you want to tell yourself and what story has been told and what stories can you move into. So that's a broad thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm intrigued to see how other people are taking that in.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello, I'm Sarah Collins. I work in a conservatorium of music over in Perth, which is an odd sort of space to work in when you're working in this area. You have some colleagues who are, you know, in electronic music who are dealing with dynamic and interactive compositional techniques where they use like data-informed, essentially sort of composing music that changes according to the data input, so that type of interaction, using AI as a collaborative tool in the creative space. I'm a historian, so I'm working on, I've got a grant that's about the cultural history of labour automation and working at it from a kind of stage perspective, looking at stage works. But my collaborators are cultural historians who work in the history of science, so sort of from the late 18th century to the early 20th century, sort of histories about ideas, about distinctions between life and non-life and artificiality and you know, what's real and what's just appearance, and all those sorts of conversations that were happening across philosophy and science and aesthetics during that period of time. And I also work with bioartists who are working in the field of synthetic biology, so making art from living, from organic material. They do a lot of critique around ideas about artificiality too. So that's really interesting. And we're also got some collaborations with a tech and policy lab. And those, it's, you know, it's something maybe that would be interesting to sort of pick out that I'd love to hear your views on too, is that I think actually it was Bailey, your comment yesterday about some areas of AI research are problem solving areas and others are interpretation areas. And I think that's a really key point in terms of how we both position ourselves, but also understand where other people are coming from. When I've had these conversations with people in the tech industry or in computer science, because we also have collaboration in computer science, tech industry people see it one way, computer science people see it in a certain way. And it's very much around problem solving. When there's a problem like bias, you make a tech solution. The tech solution to that, how do we make the technology better so it doesn't do that? Whereas from the interpretation humanities side, it's very much like let's make something that doesn't look like a problem into a problem, because we have to understand there are structures of power around this that are kind of conditioning us, seeing this as being naturalized and okay or normative and all that kind of thing. And so it's very difficult to bridge that divide. Can I just get a sense in the audience of how many people are here from a humanities arts background? And how many people are here from a industry sort of focused background? You? Has that half and half? Yeah.
Or is there another space even that's not even?
Absolutely.
It's not even-
Has anybody worked in government, in regulation or policy making? Come on, we're in Canberra.
Okay.
It's like everyone's worked for the mining industry and go. You've been in, yeah, absolutely. The consultation, you've worked with government in policy. So policy is another interesting area that maybe we can regulate our way out of the problem. Maybe we could tech solve our way out of the problem. And then the humanities and arts people, which I sort of sit with, are like, let's think about the problem. You know, so that can inform some discussion.
So just calling on my mates in the States and California and the startup community and innovation in general. I've got friends who have been in tech since the late 70s and swum with words and all sorts of other places. And there's a real movement there to, certainly with generative AI art. One of my favourite collaborators, who's deeply technically skilled, is doing pretty pictures with Pete. There's a whole movement out there where all the techos are actually using the technology to be sort of literate in the arts and such, because there's a whole, he calls it, I'm in an author book called AI Futures. Anyway, that's a weird miracle by itself, but his point is that there's a democratization of the ability to do art, because a lot of the technical difficulties have gone away. And so you sort of, in his view, no, well, they've got the ability to do it, but there's these techos doing a lot of very artistic things, is my point, and trying to pull people into that. But discovering little things like people don't have the technology literacy that they need to be able to do some of it. But an invitation to do it nevertheless. And a presentation, I think, to Congress, which is happening about now-ish, by one of those people.
So please feel free to interrupt too and like raise your hand and join the conversation, because we don't have to be on stage to.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Parker. I did work in government, and I think then I went over to the visual arts, and the chief difference between the two is the mindset. In government, it's all about not making mistakes. In art, it's about making mistakes. If you're not making mistakes, you're not going forward. And in government, it's very much hierarchical. So it doesn't matter if you've got the best idea in the world. If you haven't garnered support up above you, you might as well not worry about it. That's just a brief comment. And what I'm going to talk about here is, if you're going to talk, think about the interactions between the various disciplines. You've got to think in terms of mindsets and how they think and how they move forward, because I think that's a key thing. In government, okay, I think a good idea is the Peter Principle. Peter Principle is people rise to their level of incompetence. And I think that is a really good guide.
Yeah, no, thanks for that comment. And I certainly didn't mean that there was any sort of distinction. You know, we all, you know, as you were saying, sort of dabble in, try to cross and humanities. It's more about something where you feel your spiritual home is. In terms of that, I completely agree with you. It's a standpoint thing. It's understanding the standpoint, but also probably a temperament thing, in the sense that if you can find your person in a particular industry you want to talk to, or in a particular policy area that you want to talk to, who has a temperament of openness to a particular thing, like they enjoy creative, you know, not the creativity, innovation kind of creativity, but the quirky things, essentially. And they'll come to your conference, they'll have a conversation about staging an intervention, an artistic intervention into a policy area that will, you know, prompt some sort of change or have media outcome and that kind of thing. But for example, there's a guy in computer science that we have who is able to do the crossover. Lots of people in the sciences are, you know, humanities oriented, curious and want to know about the problems that they haven't thought of yet. And they see you as being sort of conduit potentially for that. But it's a people-based thing rather than a systems, institutions-based thing.
Just following on what you were saying, so you're also in creative space, right, Sarah? And I was wondering how many people here in the audience are actually creative as well, because that's another perspective, right? The embodied, creation of art is a different place from which we interact with the AI. And for me, that's personally really interesting because of, I guess, some of the things that were touched on yesterday in terms of the disembodied nature of the words, of the intelligence in AI at the moment that might go, will go in a direction where robots and sensors and perceiving machines are adding world context to what they do. There's we were talking about John Searle's Chinese room. There is what's called the robot reply to that problem, which is that, computers will eventually be able to understand more in the way that we do, because they will be worlded by senses and perception. But currently, as a poet and as a creative person who writes from an embodied experience of creativity, I do find interacting with an LLM is very, very different. And I do wonder what introducing that into the initiation, ideation, and iteration process, creative process, will do to our own experience, and perhaps ability even to be able to mine our own experience for those things rather than going to the LLM for those. So that's my bit of a problem.
Thanks. I was hoping to just pick up on the comment about mindset. Just to speak a little bit to the second point, which I think we've sort of started to do already. I might be guilty of making a completely half-baked thought here, but I'm hoping it might be like an opening gambit for some more conversation. Just to say that, as a lot of you will be aware, in literary studies, we have a long tradition in which criticality can have an affective dimension that involves being a bit of a bummer and being a downer. And there's sort of sometimes almost a skepticism that goes with that hermeneutic sort of suspicion of the kind of utopian problem-solving mindset that you can encounter when you're working with people who are trying to solve problems. And so I think I guess I just want to flag that from literary studies, you feel the affective dimension of the friction between disciplines, I think, when as a literary studies person, you step, and Chris, I'm sure you'd have a lot of things to say about this, you step into this, really wonderfully, really fantastically hopeful space of cybernetics. Like, I don't want to work in cybernetics because I reckon I'd be happier. I'm not unhappy in English, but, part of our job is to be a bit professionally unhappy. And we are having a lot of conversations about, post-critique, and when someone raises their head above the parapet to talk about some slightly older, potentially sort of crustily humanistic ideas around sort of post-critique. Rita Belsky's had been attacked a lot, as we all probably know. But so yeah, just to put that in the mix in case that resonates with people, to get us going, talking about number two.
I mean, something, I was just, sorry, before, but yeah, I mean, something I found from, moving from a literary studies department to a school of cybernetics is just the amazing difference that what space you're in, what sort of, who you're around, what difference that makes. And I didn't expect it to happen because, if you're just in a kitchen talking to people from different disciplines, it affects you differently. So that sort of affect that you're talking about, that might be, if you want to call it literary studies affect, is partly produced by being around a certain type. You know what I mean? It's kind of and so it's interesting, and it's not always been comfortable. We talk about in school productive discomfort, and as a kind of as something that you can push yourself a bit out of your space of comfort. And but Charlotte had a point, and then first.
Yeah, thanks.
Charlotte, very well.
Oh, yeah, I'm a PhD student here in the School of Cybernetics. much to my shame, having done a gender and women's studies undergraduate, my best part of one, I only recently read Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's famous article, Paranoid and Reparative Reading, or You're So Paranoid You Probably Think This Essay Is About You. And I was thinking about what I think it is helpful for us to think about what a reparative critical or a reparative approach to AI and machine learning might be. There's commentary on that article that what Sedgwick does there is talk less about method, which is how it's been picked up in the kind of post-criticality discourse. It's less about method and more about how we feel about ourselves when we do the work we do. And I think that's probably right. And so this goes back to the point about temperament, I think. But what I wanted to just say was I recently took part in this global institute that was run out of South Africa. And there were some great talks there by, for example, Favour, I can't remember her last name, but she's a scholar from Nigeria, and she was talking about how she noticed that a lot of her family and friends were using generative AI to create kind of positive images of themselves, kind of imagining new features of their personality, dressed in business suits or this sort of thing. And she was using that to say there's a tendency within the circle she moves in, the humanistic circles. Okay, thank you. Oh, it is better. Feel a bit. There's a tendency within humanistic circles to dismiss generative image, for example, out of hand as kind of less than or not creative. And the argument she was making is you're speaking from a position of privilege when you say that, right? Like it depends on your kind of whole life experience, your ability to kind of generate these images of yourself or not. Anyway, so I sort of thought that was the start of thinking about what a reparative. So she said that in full acknowledgement of all of the like negative effects, right, of AI systems, but might be the start of a reparative approach that says, how can we use these systems in ways that fulfill, do you know what I mean, our desire to live in meaningful ways, right? Which I think goes to the point that you were making too. Sorry, that was very rambly, but yeah.
I guess just reinforcing where you've got to with that, and I was curious about the intersection between both your thoughts. What we are witnessing in my circle of friends, and it's an extensive circle of friends, you know, they've worked for NASA and Apple and done startups right at the very beginning. They've been immersed in this forever. And there is such a groundswell of I can be a different person here, and a whole willingness to fail, where the industry sort of underscored that a little bit. But I mean, this is the States. You're supposed to try and do new things frontier-wise, but it's almost like this whole, the garage door's been lifted, you know, the whole metaphor of the garage and, you know, the technology history and such was all invented in garages where you could make mistakes. Now they've lifted the door and everyone's just like rushing into this space and doing things and trying to be new people. And they're fairly privileged people, but there's a lot of you know, a band of distress. Not everyone's trading as well as everyone would like them to believe. There's a lot of hardship there. There's a lot of politics in the States, and everyone's just rushing into this space because here they can be who they want to be, and they can explore all these things. So I've also experienced this between science, and my mother was an artist and my father an engineer, so I've lived in this space between the two. That's why I put half an arm up, because the two sides quite see it eye to eye, as you can imagine. So in the science world that I've lived in human and data-informed design, because I've done that in all sorts of buildings and live spaces and such, there's been a distrust in narrative as something that's like the bedrock of what's going on here. A little bit like the two stories you were telling Stephanie. Yeah. And I do legal work as well. You've just got to be able to tell yourself a good story, and you've got to tell someone else a good story. And then things can happen because you see the affordances and the possibilities. So I'm sort of curious about how people are making that move, having a foot in both worlds, which I always have. and how you represent yourself, and whether you can make that a hopeful space, which is why the presentation to Congress, please don't lock this down, because we're actually having a better time with some of our lives than we've had for a very long time. We want to keep on telling that story and make more out of it and work out where we can spin wheels in industries and such, for sure, but it's not just about science, it's about being let out of the box.
I was going to make a reply to your comment, and it's the difference that I was talking earlier about cultures, work cultures, especially public service cultures, and getting comment. And it's all about pointing out mistakes. And basically, if you write a piece, let's say you've written a policy piece, and then it will be edited to death. Now, in comparison, let me say in the visual arts, let's say in photomedia, which I did, people will want to get comments back on their work. And what used to happen is that they put up their piece of work, they then talk about their ideas, what they wanted to hope for, their influences. This would go for about 2 to 3 minutes, and then it'd be over to the audience. And the audience idea was, well, okay, that's your aims. Are you actually fulfilling this aims? And then it's just letting the comments come in, and that's the difference between the two. And it's an exploration of a theme, and that is a really important difference in cultural way of thinking about how they move forward. And so when you think about working with government, you have to think about, often they'll have an agenda or a priority list. These are the areas, and they often don't think outside of those areas. Sorry to be disappointing.
Yeah, a question I had that comes from that is, I mean, this is something we talk a lot about in school, is how do we deal with the unknown here? Because there is a general recognition at government level, like we're in an unknown space. We're moving to futures that involve unknowability. So there's surely at some level of recognition, but I mean, I take your point, but how do we, because if you're saying that in the arts, the humanities, we're more comfortable with the unknowability, we have a lot to contribute to that conversation, but yet, and I think so I feel that there is that acknowledgement that, well, people are saying we don't know what's going to happen with AI, and we need help, and we might be experts in that sort of the unknown futures that we're moving into. Yeah, do you want to, I mean, we've had about half an hour, so do you want to come join? Yeah. So we need 4 more people up. Bailey, do you want to do it? Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So we'll do the same thing of, if we can just briefly introduce ourselves and then locate yourself in this space that we're talking about.
My name is Bailey Brits. I work at UNSW. I'm on an ONI postdoc, so I'm trained in literary studies and philosophy and cultural analysis. But I work in a research institute that's mostly computer scientists now, and part of my remit as part of my postdoc, which is on what I call motivation-sensitive machine reading, is to work with computer scientists and to try to produce real collaborations with computer scientists that will solve ONI problems, really. And so that's very interesting to me. It's not what I've been trained in, but I've been asked to use my training in a different discipline in counterintuitive ways.
Morning, my name is Pierre Monchamp. I'm a freelance consultant for the last 2-3 years, where I help medical technology company to go through regulations. That's what pays the bills. That's not really what makes me happy. What makes me happy is more to create medical technology to help people. I struggle to reconcile the two, so I've decided to try to do more of something I like, which is to make music. And that's how I got connected to this community through, I would say, Chris, with a creative AI conference in Sydney 2 years ago. in which I was connected to Caroline Pegram, who I know is a fellow or resident here, working on creative stuff as well, because Caroline won the AI Eurovision during COVID, when the real Eurovision couldn't happen. So I'm very curious to see how having a cybernetics approach to things could help me maybe conciliate all these things, the music and the medical technology together, because I know there's opportunities there.
Good morning, my name is Stephanie Parker. I'm a multimedia artist. I studied at the AIM School of Art, so I'm a local. I'm very much concerned about ideas of memory in the landscape, how we make it, how objects become associated with it, ideas of mnemonic memory, so the use of the body in making memory. That all sounds quite esoteric. However, I would point to you for example, Anzac ceremony, on Anzac Day, on how we have marches and how that makes meaning, okay? Now, so how did I get to this? I saw an advert for it and I thought I'd come along and listen. So I'm very interested in another media, which is literary studies, and it's been very illuminating to listen to your mindsets.
Thanks. Hello. So I'm Jo Leach, and I'm a professor and director of the Australian National Centre for the Public Awareness of Science in the College of Science here at the ANU. I've just come off a stint of being acting dean of science. And I'm trained in literature.
Infiltrated.
No, but I'm trained in literature, philosophy, science, and biophysics. And when it comes to AI, I'm usually collaborating with colleagues who are using AI as a tool to an end in another field. So the example I have is I've got a project at the moment where we're looking at gene editing and using little nanoparticles to deliver gene editing tools that are all modeled by AI. I mean, what could go wrong, right? So I'm really interested in lots of these questions. But one of the things that came up yesterday that just really kept me awake last night was thinking about this notion of literary form and the fable, which I find so compelling, and the normative structures that come with the idea of fable. Because that's one of the things that I typically bring to a lot of the collaborations I work on is a kind of normative framework. Now that can be responsible innovation, that can be an ethical framework, there's many, right? And so I'm very interested in the normative structures we might bring literary study to inform a kind of new way of thinking. I mean, there's a sense with the fable we were talking about yesterday, we know the answer to what happens at the end of the fable of the paperclips, and we don't want to get there, right? It's built into the story.
Yeah.
And so I'm so interested in that as a way of talking with colleagues about the future of their work, about what, in a way that isn't just grasping at the ethical, because let's face it, I think somebody, I can't remember who said this, but a lot of my research colleagues get kind of tired of having people lecture them. The humanities gets put in the position of a police car that's following the fancy car, right? We're the police car trying to slow things down. And I don't actually think most of us feel that way, but that's the position. And I'm wondering if some of these literary forms could be another way of bringing a normative framework that's more productive. So I got very excited. You kept me up.
Getting back to the questions, I'm actually interested in point 3, and it's this idea of surveillance and encryption. And I think it was this year when I think the head of ASIO got up at the National Press Club and complained bitterly that about these private encryption networks that they couldn't break into. And so that raises some really interesting questions about the role of the state and privacy, which we haven't really dealt with. And one of the interesting things Big Idea recently had was there was a talk by, I think it was the head of quantum computing in Australia. And basically, it wasn't advertorial, but basically saying how far they'd actually gone. And there's also, Amazon is also building three very big data centers in Australia. And I'm beginning to think of connections between all three. So I'm not trying to be doom or what have you, but I just see these things and I see the connections. And I think of government, and I know they're well-meaning and they have our best interests at heart. But I think we don't really discuss this too much. You know, for example, how many people here are actually on a private encryption network? Okay, and there you go. And you know, for example, how many people here moved from WhatsApp because it got broken into? Okay, so that is a brief thing about fear of privacy. Okay, and I think we talk about the positive aspects of AI, have you? But just to go down the other side of it, unfortunately, in the world, we live in a world of conflict. And unfortunately, we live in a world of major conflicts in Europe. And the Ukrainians have been very innovative of how they use technology. I'll give you a good example. The way, for example, the Ukrainians have swept the Russians from the Black Sea by using drones. Now, that is very, very interesting. And I am absolutely sure that they're thinking along using how can we use AI with drone technology. So it's something which we don't really put to the side, but we need to start to think about.
Thank you. Just on the encryption point, and I'd love to hear your view, Bailey, on this and others as well. I mean, I think that, you know, when I was thinking about that question, the anti-encryption argument from a government perspective in the UK at least was around child safety. So that if you were for encryption, you were essentially for the pedophiles. And that was, you know, cast quite, you know, consciously in that way. So I sort of put that there as a bit of a I don't know, a thinking point, because there's no right answer, right? There's no right answer. We all want privacy, but there is this old, and it's not even a new idea, the problem of sort of law and order needing to have some sort of, you know, connection with the networks and everything like that. But the second point there around materialization, I was thinking of Kat's fantastic story that she read out in the morning of yesterday. The idea that a regulator could say, because things are invisible, in order to make it more apparent what we're dealing with, we want to make them material. We want to create this algo, the auntie, the bot, so that everyone is reminded all the time of what's happening, and therefore it's more visible, it's more transparent, we can talk about it. So materialization is a move towards visibility. But then, you know, there's this tension between a desire for transparency and visibility, which is an anti-encryption intention as well, and the desire for privacy and being private citizens, having private internal lives that aren't surveilled in some way. Bailey, did you?
Yes, I think for me, it's about the two first questions. I'm thinking in terms of AI as a translator and something that remove barriers in. No, I'm autistic, which means I suffer from a deficit of communication, which is like not being able to read people's face, interpret inflection in voices and sort of thing. And when you chat with ChatGPT, there's none of that. Like, it's only words. And I remember the sentence "words matter," which was Lex Friedman organizing a 4-people debate about Palestine back in February. So it was a very heated debate for several hours. And at some point, people were shouting at each other, but it was still respectful because they were shouting at each other arguments, not at each other personas. And it's the kind of thing you can do with ChatGPT. You know, you can insult it. It doesn't care. And I'm really taking that as something on the positive side. And I would say on the negative side, to bounce on what Stephanie was saying, and to a lot of what you said yesterday about this hypocrisy, I would say, of not having the real discussion of, man, Microsoft signed the PRISM things that Snowden denounced in 2013. Microsoft was the first one to sign it, contribute to giving up data against the law to the government. And like I said yesterday, Microsoft is funding this space and funding OpenAI and being the backend of all institutions in the world. I do sessional lecturing in 3 different universities, couple hours of lecturing, costing me more hours of walking through the atrocities of Microsoft interface to give my details to the university so they can pay me. It's absurd. I have no other words than absurd. I was the first auditee from the TGA after COVID. You know, they stopped the audits, going face-to-face in companies to audit medical manufacturer. After they woke up of COVID 3 years later, they thought, okay, what are we going to do? Let's audit a manufacturer remotely. So they picked a manufacturer because I believe, because we were making CPAP masks and Philips Respironics were currently recording millions of machines that were killing people in the world because they did a shitty job. So they called a small manufacturer of CPAP, it's a company of less than 5 people full-time. They literally costed us 3 days full-time of scanning and sending them documents that they didn't even read. Then to keep 3 people busy for 2 days, full-time screen face, going through their SharePoint beta version, that the person literally told me, thank you, you taught me to use SharePoint. And ending up, for me, a year of being abused by the TGA, of going into a downward spiral of depression, not being supported by my employers, who was telling me, don't do waves. We don't want to go against, just comply. And I'm hopeful because every time I've seen Geneviève Bell, the creator of the school, in conference, she talks about the discomfort and that we have to face the discomfort. Like I said, I'm autistic. I have lived experience with discomfort. I would say I have a PhD in discomfort. So I'm really keen to work with regulators to make regulations hopeful, not depressive.
Thank you. I'm interested in the idea of curricular regulation. We've touched on sort of every one of these questions, and every one of these topics. There's quite a lot to sort of catch up on. But just to respond to you, Sarah, and what you were asking on the encryption question, I have no good answer to that because, of course, there's no right answer, and it's one of the same problems of control and resistance dynamics that we've seen, throughout the 20th century. Which of course are always interesting and always changing. But one thing I am really interested in response to that question is the way forums like 4chan work. So 4chan is not encrypted, it's open, anybody can join. Most people are anonymous, right? And I think regulators, and I'm not against regulators, but regulators and sort of security agencies and things like that monitor these forums. And I'm really interested in the forms of discourse and the forms of language and image use that have grown up in these highly controversial forums, often with very nasty things going on, but often with, kind of potentially interesting political formations as well going on the sides, these very, very kind of mixed environments. And you look at the use of irony, the use of humor, the development of shitposting, and things like this. And these are kind of, and this is all loaded language because, in humanities, we love to talk about strategies of resistance. We all love resistance. The text has to be resisting something. We're resisting capitalism. And of course, forms of resistance can go either way. They can be forms of resistance, coming from child pornographers who are trying to, conceal their actions. But, you sort of get these forms of resistance across the board. And I think that's taken an interesting role. It's not an encryption role. It's kind of a language encryption role. It's based on form, right? It's the creation of forms of humor and irony, which you can never quite tell when somebody's being serious. And so one thing that, yeah, I was speaking to somebody at the ONI about this, and there's, you know, they said one thing that's really interesting is that a lot of people write manifestos, and a lot of people write, you know, manifestos saying they want to, you know, go and shoot a whole bunch of people, whatever their particular adversary happens to be, you know, from which sort of end of the kind of extreme politics sort of network they're in. But these are not serious, right? These don't represent intentionality, right? They represent a certain form of expressivity, right? And you can never tell when somebody is speaking from a point of, you know, when saying becomes action, which is what we were talking yesterday. And that's partly down to what we would call in literary studies formal innovation, you know? And I think that this is kind of fascinating, and it, you know, without wanting to make any kind of judgments or critiques on this, I think that this is one way in which this kind of move against encryption from every part of the political and ethical spectrum is kind of happening. And it's actually interesting for literary scholars that this is happening formally, not sort of technologically to you know, evoke that kind of arbitrary distinction. So I think that's really interesting, and I think that's really interesting for us. And I think the way satire and humor are used are very important for what we're thinking about literature and the interactions with computer scientists and stuff like that. And you know, literary scholars have been working on satire forever. One experience for me that was very interesting was going to the online conference 18 months ago when ChatGPT had just come out. And I was saying, oh, well, you know, these are the kind of sort of rich text things that, you know, LLMs can't do. The computer scientists put up their hands. I was the only humanities person there. And he was like, but they can do satire. You know, I can punch into ChatGPT that I need to speak like, you know, one of the news hosts in a satirical format. And I sort of pushed back and I said, no, well, that's not actually satire. You need a different set of formal requirements for it to count as satire. And you know, these debates are really, really interesting about intention, about form, about context, about interpretance, and the kind of the broad, complex field in which texts are constituted, right? And in which interpretation is constituted, and in which meaning is made. So I think that you know, that's one entry point, and I'm really interested in the ways in which sort of computer scientists and humanities people can work. Not to speak too long, but I was also so interested in Bridget's point about the affective dimensions. And you know, you go into a room of computer scientists, and what you try to do is strip that. You don't want to be secondary, right? You want to. I think one of the things humanities does, we're often the people of critique, we're secondary. They come up with the ideas, and we're like, you know, the police car, oh no, or oh look at the power dynamics or the politics or whatever. And there's this anxiety of being secondary, which is interesting to think through and mediate when we're in the humanities. And then there's this anxiety of being kind of the unhappy person in the room. And I think that part of that needs to be shed, I think, in those environments strategically. But I think it's also something that's going to be solved simply by more fora, real collaboration that benefits both parties between computer scientists and humanities people. Because I think sometimes, you know, the introduction of a humanities person into these forums allows the computer scientists to be the unhappy people that perhaps they want to be. Do you know what I mean? And there's this kind of affective kind of reciprocity, and then it allows the humanities person to be the positive, well, let's make something, you know, let's solve this problem, person that they kind of wanted to be. So there's an interesting kind of affective circularity that could happen, you know, if we're to be hopeful of that.
I mean, so it made me think actually about a sort of strange thought, but you know, I'm interested in story, you know, stories involving non-humans where there's a kind of exchange of characteristics. I mean, you're almost talking about that in a professional setting where you might walk into a room and you've got a certain role that you, or certain affect that you feel like you need, but then when you're with someone with a very different affect, you can potentially exchange those kind of roles, and so that could be that's a sort of could be a positive, productive process. But yeah.
I'm going to talk a little bit about something from my project, and of course, if you're from Australia, very, very familiar with this, is the Anzac legend. And I would actually suggest to you it's become more of a fable these days. And some very good work is being done in Canberra at Australian Defence Force Academy. And I think in Canberra, I think Joan Beaumont is a very good historian, and she's dealt with with World War One and the being at home, and what has become interesting is that a lot of things about World War One at home in Australia has actually been largely forgotten. You know, yes, we know about the conscription referendums that were held. We don't know the back, you know, these days, at the distance we are, we don't know the backstory of those sorts of things. We don't know, for example, that in 1917 in Australia there was a great strike. So the ideas of Anzac, and it's unfortunately, having looked at the Australian War Memorial, hope no one's here from the Australian War Memorial. Some of the displays that they actually have, I would argue, feed into this legend. The way they have, for example, in the World War One displays, the way it emphasises the Anzac legend, and in this sort of, and it's actually become a fable which has direct consequences, and it's something we need to think about.
So Charlotte, oh, okay, and then Charlotte.
So just this morning, my partner was reporting in from the UK on a visit to Hendon Airfield, which was one of the places that people flew out of in the First World War and Second World War. Anyway, he was saying that they've changed the displays. We went 20 years ago, they've gone now. And he said, because they want to recruit people, they're forgetting to share the fact that only 1 in 4 people came back. And this is just this morning, he shared that with me. It's like we need more people in the Air Force, so we're not going to tell that part of the story anymore. We've shaped it so it's now serving today. And then I was speaking also to a gentleman this morning who just turned 97, who was in the Air Force in the UK in the Second World War. And so these are very recent experiences, and the fables, I think, are very much shaped by the present as well, the filters that we put on. And they're spatial things, they're material things. It's what you can see and touch and feel. And so they become the next version of it, because the spatial and materiality of now, without the stories from the people who are actually there, the 97-year-old, they become all that you can understand about that thing, unless you have the ability to be able to go back in time, which none of us really do. So we're getting these filters on these filters. So anyway, today's experience, exactly what you were talking about, the fable is shaped, and we lose the ability to be able to touch the past. I can actually touch the past. I've got a World War I B-2C propeller in my lounge room with bullet holes in it. So I can always touch the past and the stories that went with it.
Just to reply to your comment, I think it actually, you know, it really emphasises the importance of the humanities in actually being able to examine this, go back to those details. And that is the major problem with AI, because it feeds off this top, in my perception, doesn't have this critical of ideas. Okay, so if you ask about let's say Anzac, for example, you could talk about other things as well. It will regurgitate this sort of stuff. It won't give the critical comment that you need, and this is the role that humanities plays, I think, in actually giving this critical comment in this sort of thing and talking about these issues. For example, in the conscription issue, there was in Australia there was a substantial Irish rejection of conscription for the simple reason because of the 1916 Brits putting down the Irish Rebellion. They didn't want to fight for the British armed forces, you know. And even Ireland today, they do not have the same sort of commemorative ideas of of England. For example, the red poppy is not used in Ireland.
Joan, I just wanted to ask you a question in terms of kind of public engagement with questions of how kind of AI works and generative AI works. And we heard yesterday about kind of the stochastic parrot or the bullshit generator, all of which are geared towards, in a sense, maybe educating the public in the strong case about that the outputs of these models are essentially meaningless, right? But my question is, what I'm curious about is this question of what role do the humanities have to play in troubling the idea that this is essentially like a scientific issue or a linguistic issue rather than a public issue involving questions of science and linguistics. Do you know what I mean? And how do we contribute to maybe flipping that conversation?
I mean, look, not much, but I'll just tackle it maybe by saying, educating the public paradigm is like the start of the problem. Yeah. Because there's a sense in which the way publics have engaged, whether it's ChatGPT or something like that, has been astonishing. And so expertise is diffuse out there in the community, and it's already happening. People are being very generative and creative and pretty fabulous with these things already. So I don't think it's an educative paradigm that we need to think about. And what I was thinking about yesterday as I was listening to people talking also this morning is about talked a little bit about critical paradigm, but you know, hermeneutics, interpretation, I think is really also where it's at, and that people need to be kind of familiar or obey or comfortable in multiple interpretations. And I think that's already happened in many ways of our life, but I think we need to, I don't know, maybe foreground a few alternative interpretations. I guess that one of the things about your talk yesterday, you know, thinking about the public representations of AI or singularity or any of these science fiction sort of notions, right? What struck me yesterday, and might not be right, but they were kind of monolithic. They looked very similar, although I think you did a really great job kind of pulling them apart in a deep way. And I guess it's that kind of work to have those discussions around what kind of representations we're constantly seeing of AI, and it's the real experiences that publics have with AI. I can use it quite differently, and that's good, right? And so having that discussion become a little bit more outside of an educative mode, a little bit more playful, I would say.
Why don't we do one more rotation? Would that be right? So if we could get 4 more people up on who want to chat. Do you want to come up? Or yeah, it's nice to hear from you. Thanks, Jane.
And somebody to microphone.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I guess we don't always need 4. We can have 3. If anyone else wants to come up. But yeah. So yeah, we'll just do the same thing of if you could just briefly introduce yourself and sort of position yourself in the space that we're talking about. And
especially for anyone who wasn't here yesterday, I'm Kat. I'm a writer. I write technical speculative fiction, mostly about the history of technology and our relationship with machines. But I also work in tech policy, so I do a lot of work in right to privacy and online safety and encryption and surveillance. And I worked in the tech industry for a long time, so I'm quite used to these kind of cross-disciplinary conversations, but most, I suppose, like interestingly, trying to convince marketing teams who are throwing $1 million a day on Facebook ads to respect people's privacy, which I think is like one of the most difficult things I've had to do. But yeah, that's my background. Yeah.
My name's Tyne. I work across literary studies, surveillance studies, and digital humanities. So really, I'm interested in cultural representations of changing forms of surveillance. But when I say representations, which perhaps goes to question one, and maybe the penultimate question about emotions, is the ways in which cultural artifacts, especially literature, can represent some of the stuff that's going on, but actually reconfigure how we think about it through form. So actually create kind of experimental modes of articulating anxiety or disgust or different kinds of emotions through the register of the text itself. And so across, I guess, the discussion, one thing I'm interested in that maybe hasn't come up is the ways that disciplines themselves are being transformed through AI. So, you know, we're talking in kind of abstract ways to an extent about literary studies or computer science and so on. But I think a big question here, and maybe a kind of anxiety that's just sitting on the surface that everyone's very increasingly aware of, is that kind of structures and the modes of the work that we're doing are themselves changing right in front of us in kind of exciting and terrifying, but somewhat unknown ways. And the digital humanities is kind of interested in this too, in that the kind of infrastructures and collections of data that we're working with in that space are themselves kind of open to questions of surveillance, even though they purport to be the ones that critique them. And just one final point that maybe we can come back to, thinking about the role of disgust, one thing that's at the center of this too, I think, is an increasing sense that this is also an ecological catastrophe of some kind. AI is, as people would have seen, there's a lot being written in the last 6 months about, you know, the gargantuan quantities of water that a lot of these systems actually require. And that is a shared problem for art, science, those working on large language models. That's a collective issue that will only intensify. And I think what that issue already is starting to create is this feeling of disgust, like, ugh. Thinking back to, you know, the moment of hysteria around, oh, can DALL-E create, please, a photo, you know, photorealistic image of a dog on a skateboard in the style of DALL-E? Like, everyone was churning those out. We've kind of stopped doing that now. Like, that moment was a kind of 6-month frenzy that's just ended. Because I think there's now a feeling of disgust around, oh, okay. And then on top of that now, the environmental question, which is at the center of all of this. So anyway, that was a bit of a discursive rant.
Thanks, Tyne. I'm Charlotte. I'm extremely enthusiastic about this topic, in case you hadn't picked up on that. My PhD research is, like, my question is, you know, how should we interpret transformers, basically, the generative language models that sit underneath ChatGPT? And I'm coming at that from my background in literary and theatre studies in particular, as a theatre maker, but also with a background in product management and kind of database management and so on, and a bit of digital humanities thrown in there too. Reflecting on the comments that have been made already, and I was thinking about what Joan was saying about, you know, we need new normative, can we bring over different normative structures from the humanities into this space? My intent is to bring over kind of theatricality as a mode of engagement with AI systems, to think about the ways that when we interact with ChatGPT, we are kind of staging a play, which we are a character and they are a character. One of the ways of doing that is through kind of large-scale quantitative analysis of interactions with ChatGPT. And one thing that's really interesting, I was thinking about what Bailey was saying about kind of paranoia, and the ways that people kind of pick up the methods from one discipline and move them into another. You know, one thing that happens a lot in these interactions on ChatGPT is that you have users basically applying literary analysis to the outputs of ChatGPT and support some argument that they want to make. So one thing that was really popular to do in the early days was to say, write me a poem about Joe Biden, praising Joe Biden, write me a poem praising Donald Trump, and then a kind of a critical analysis of the outputs. In order to reveal the biases hidden within the system, right? And this happens on an extremely large scale. So just really interesting to see the way, in a sense, that the publics are leading the way in terms of moving between what might be disciplinary kind of approaches to AI without worrying about the baggage associated. And the last thing I just wanted to throw into the mix here was thinking about, you know, the talk on Lewis Carroll yesterday, and then the talk about China Brain and Bailey's work as well. I was thinking about, you know, what is the thing that unites these two talks? Well, I was thinking like J.L. Austin is a kind of a unifying figure there, because we're talking about performativity and we're talking about Searle, who was a student of Austin. And in fact, that got me to thinking about the ways that we can look at the traffic between literary studies and AI, or the humanities and AI. You know, people who come to mind are people like Lewis Carroll. You know, Shaw was a big influence on Joseph Weizenbaum, who came up with the ELIZA chatbot. Shakespeare is just constantly referenced in AI. And then in the other direction, I mean, Searle is a very interesting figure in terms of the way that he plays a major role in AI and cognitive science, but also there's the famous kind of Derrida-Searle debate around kind of intentionality and the role that intentionality plays in dictating the meaning of a text. So I'm thinking about how can we kind of recover and draw out the traffic, which is already long-standing, right? But we don't need to be the first people doing that, because it's already happened in some ways. Yeah.
Just quickly on that, I mean, I think what you're also talking about is this, the way that contemporary culture is now suffused by an obsessive interest in kind of accelerationism and a nowness. There's a book I've just been reading that I would recommend, kind of thinking about all of this in relation to AI, called Immediacy by literary critic Anna Kornbluh. People may have seen this book circulating. And what Kornbluh is saying in this book is we've become kind of unable to even see the ways that now everything is shot through with a sense of itness, nowness, what's next, rather than, you know, the things that literary critics, for example, or literary scholars are trained in, is to sit with the thing. Like literally sit with it. What is it doing? What are its modes? What is its form? What is it speaking back to? What is it in conversation with? So I think there's a sense in which disciplines are kind of changing and speeding up, and they're responding to what's next, but the actual methods that have always been employed in something like literary studies are needed more now than ever to challenge a kind of mindset problem that's a problem for all kinds of architectures of thought and kind of disciplinary spaces. The example she uses in the beginning of this book is the, she calls it Van Gogh, which is the interactive digital Van Gogh exhibits you've probably seen. And it's like, the argument there is, there's something deeply wrong with this. The fact that we now need a kind of moving version with stuff kind of everywhere of the artwork. We're not, it's not good enough to just stand in front of the artwork and look at it. We need to have a digital exhibit. We need to be able to have Prosecco and do yoga in front of it as a kind of novelty. That's what we need, because it's now, it's immediate, it's interactive. And I'm not necessarily saying that's not cool or a bad thing, but there's a big shift in a kind of mindset, cultural feeling that's attached to AI and everything to do with it, that certain kinds of modes of thinking can not necessarily resist, but just help us think about the problems and implications of them.
Yeah, if I can pick up on your point on immediacy, and there's a bit of a mention of effective accelerationism yesterday as well. I think contextualizing this within the incentive structures of industry is really important to be able to bridge that gap between our disciplines. Because AI and generative AI is being used as a tool in industry to increase efficiency and increase speed and increase immediacy, or at least like that's what happens when you put technology on top of capitalism, perhaps. And all these organizations are looking to, I mean, venture capital is a lot less cheap than it was a few years ago. So companies are looking to reduce headcount and reduce costs. And AI, even though like there are enormous, I suppose, like abstracted or offset costs in terms of environment, is like cheap per dollar. So I think like trying to find like where's the common ground and where's the common goals between literary studies and humanities, and trying to look at AI like not in this bubble of the context of the last couple of years, but the history of technology and machines and automation, I think is where I'd like to see that conversation happen. Yeah.
Thanks. Such fascinating comments. I kind of want to pick up on what you said, Tyne, about immediacy, and I think this kind of connects how Kat, you started talking about capitalism straight after that, because that was absolutely going to be my next question. How do we interrogate the relationship between not being able to just look at a Van Gogh and needing the Van Gogh to be moving, needing it to be a kind of commodified experience where you do yoga and have Prosecco? How is there a way to think about this logic of immediacy that's built into some of this technology, and the way in which resisting that might also relate to resisting kind of capitalist novelty? Is there something, I wonder if there's something to draw out from what you're saying, Tyne, and also what Charlotte's been saying about drawing on what's already there on a methodological level, because it seems to me that drawing on what's already there and the history of thought has a kind of parallel with resisting a kind of capitalistic need for novelty. I don't know, is there something to say there? Yeah. Does that make any sense?
Yes. Well, my thought is I was thinking about sort of the same issues in terms of that immediacy. And so again, because I'm interested in theatre, I'm interested in liveness and how the experience of liveness, sometimes people say that liveness is the thing that makes the theatre, right? Like if it's not live, then it's television or whatever. But Philip Oslander has kind of rethought about what liveness is and talked about liveness as a framing of an experience, right? So you can watch Taylor Swift perform live on Disney Plus, right? And I think that what's interesting is that, again, with the ChatGPT on Twitter, everyone's posting these screenshots of their interactions, right? Screenshots are a kind of photography. And what's being attempted there, I think, is to kind of share a live interaction with ChatGPT. And I think that one of the ways that people talk about these generative AI models in the context of the arts, in the context of like a Van Gogh, I know generative AI wasn't sort of the driving force there, but is that, and even we've talked about it today, like democratizing the arts, is that it gives everyone an opportunity to have an individual live experience with some kind of creative entity, right? And I think that is, and that's partly a capitalist kind of, like it's a, like we can market it to people as live, and we know now that this is the way that musicians are making money, is through live performances. So I feel like there's something in all of that about like, yeah, liveness and immediacy and that being part of the kind of the product offering, I guess. And just one other thing I wanted to say, like to feed into this, on your point as well, is like one of the things that's been made Transformers so popular is this notion of the scaling law, which says, if there's three factors, there's the amount of compute that you throw at it, the number of parameters that the model has, or the amount of data that you have available. And as long as you can turn on one of those knobs, then you're guaranteed improved performance. And it makes them very attractive as a place to sink your investment, because you have the scaling law as a kind of a way to shore up your bet, right? And so there's, I think, all of which is to say there are so many different dynamics at play. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just brief off that, which is to try and, I guess, triangulate where you were coming at from, Bridget, too, is, question of too late capitalism the arts, and then kind of methods of thinking and understanding. And maybe the big thing here too is, you know, think about successive conservative governments in this country and globally have tried to erode systematically the humanities, and in particular, disciplines like history and literary studies. And then again, we come in this kind of circular maneuver where, oh, students are still enrolling in English. Shocking. The degrees have been made more expensive, but it hasn't changed enrollment figures. Why is that? And I think one of the responses to that is, why does a student, first year, Bachelor of Arts, or whatever, want to study literary texts? Well, unlike, you know, certain kinds of capitalistic accelerationism and modes of computation, the text opens up possibilities rather than closes them down. The idea that you could have multiple perspectives and multiple interpretations, and seems a very simplistic point, but I think that's actually what's going on there. The kind of imaginative expansiveness and personal development, actually, which can come from being able to sit with something that allows you an active role in interpretation, but encourages multiple modes of thinking rather than reducing and kind of collapsing and simplifying and channeling towards some, you know, crystallized corporate output. That's also what's going on. And like, I don't think that will change, actually. You could say the same about history and so on. So that kind of quite bureaucratic question of, are the disciplines that we're talking about going to endure or disappear under these conditions? Well, hopefully and probably not, for like very obvious reasons.
Got 3 questions up there. Okay, so I had a question as a disciplinary interloper arriving in kind of at this conference about literary studies and what constitutes a valid text for analysis. I'm interested because you could argue that a ChatGPT is just that, it's a chat, right? And the literary studies people go off and study people chatting in the street. I don't know. And why is there a tendency to analyze the things being generated by this chatbot as text that's valid and alongside a text that's kind of carefully been thought about, published, been through peer review processes, been through editors, you know, the traditional things that we apply to a book, for example, and then we might analyze the book. And can you apply the same kind of critical lenses on just chat versus a published text? And what are you kind of missing out in making those, I don't know, that kind of judgment? Something along those lines. I'm kind of interested in hearing a bit more about that. Yeah.
Very good question. I mean, like, what makes up the canon? Which, you know, in a sense is a feedback loop, because that is the purpose of literary studies, is to query and question the canon. Like, why would we study this instead of this? You know, or we're aghast that suddenly we have to study the language poets in the 70s or whatever. I actually had someone at a conference 2 weeks ago say something in response to something I said that was very similar, Jasper, but the comment was phrased as an argument that actually now everything is a text and everything could be the object of study for literary scholarship, which I disagree with. But I think your question seems to come from a point of, well, the networks in which meaning is now, which was touched on earlier, being constituted and organised and reflected on, have expanded in these kind of, you know, surprising and exciting but terrifying ways. So it would be naive and negligent to not be looking further afield, which I think the discipline is doing to an extent.
No, well, I want to answer it because it's a question that I've been grappling with, because I have a chapter that I'm trying to write in which I do this, right? And the way that I'm approaching it is this: I'm thinking about my work as being part of kind of critical AI studies or critical ML studies. Critical AI studies maybe studies AI systems as cultural phenomena. Critical ML studies maybe studies ML models, right, as texts. But the way I'm thinking about my analysis, which is of interactions with ChatGPT, is as a reception studies piece, right? So I'm thinking, how do Twitter users receive ChatGPT as a text, right? Not its outputs per se, but itself as a cultural text, right? And I think, well, first of all, I'd say most of it's really boring, right? So if I read it as text, like if I read the outputs themselves as texts, and in fact, what I've ended up doing in I've done a topic model to try and get across the whole thing, which is just a way of clustering, what are the types of conversations that people are having. And that topic model, I actually excluded the output of the model from my topic model. So I just have the tweets and the user side of the interaction, because what I am interested in is how are users constructing ChatGPT in their interaction and ChatGPT itself as a cultural text, right? And I personally think that that's an interesting way to do that.
This might be the last question we'll see. We're having very nice long answers to things, but we're almost at the end. Two more questions, we'll see if we can make it.
So this isn't, I guess, so much as a question as just relating that to immediacy and that exhibition Van Gogh, and also what Kat was saying yesterday about our creative practice being a space of agency that is kind of outside, outside of the structures of surveillance and so on. There's a wonderful book I just wanted to mention that connects with this about the attention economy, thinking about this, what these sort of exhibitions and what it does to our attention and what it means. So Jenny Odell, who is a visual artist, has written a book called How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy. Everyone's nodding, they know it. But I just thought it was a wonderful way of thinking about that, what you're saying, Tyne, about that space of reading and being with the text and, looking back to all the connections of the text through history and so on, that sort of attention versus the attentional loops that we can get caught up with, the acceleration of sort of our attention as well when we're interacting with technology. So I don't know whether you want to say anything to that.
Well, just to maybe connect the question with Jasper's is like, the author is dead, but also people care about people. So the question of authorship is retained regardless of the proliferation of different modes of textuality. People as human beings still care about where did this come from? What are the kind of networks in which it was produced? What are the conditions under which this art was made? And that inevitably and always leads us back to the question of authorship. And, how did a mind in the world at work come up with this? What is that mind's background? So that is just something that will persist in some ways.
Big Jenny Odell fan. And if I can't answer Jasper's question from a literary perspective because I'm also an imposter, but I do find this question of the legitimacy of generated texts very interesting. And I think as a creative person, I hope this isn't coming from a place of just being concerned or defensive about the legitimacy of my own work, but I tend to feel like if it's that response or that classic phrase of if you couldn't be bothered writing it, then why should I be bothered reading it? And there was a bit of I think it may have been in Judith's talk yesterday, Sam Altman and other kind of entrepreneurs talking about AI learning in the same way that children do as a way of legitimizing their business model. Yeah, which it serves their particular narrative, and I don't necessarily agree with that narrative, but it is a way of attempting to legitimize those outputs as well, I think. But yeah, again, I'm interested in connecting with other humans, and I'm interested in the context of the text and who wrote it and why and under what conditions. Even though I write a lot of stories about talking to machines, it's maybe a bit meta. Any others?
One thing it's just I really remember this, which maybe changes the whole thing, is I forget what it's called, but there was actually a legitimate journal launched 3 or 4 weeks ago, which has taken and published and will continue to take submissions for AI human generated poetry. So humans working with AI, this journal is legitimately publishing hybrid works. So I think that says something about this is no longer a binary AI or human. The field itself is taking quite legitimately the AI human collaboration as a publishable output that humans and AI will then themselves respond to.
We'll make this the last question.
Very quickly, and it's I guess it's a topical thing that I'd be interested to hear response. So a news story this morning is that on the eve of the Olympics, 9 network staff are threatening to go on strike, and obviously high impact moment to go on strike, the journalists going on strike. And 2 of the issues, and this comes back to Tyne and the Vincent van Gogh Prosecco experience. So the 2 issues are that the journalists are objecting to Nine spending a lot of money putting, celebrities in the Olympics and putting them up in expensive hotels, but they're not journalists, they're not sports specialists, so they've spent a lot of money on that. But also AI, the use of AI in journalism, and that is so there's these kind of interesting bifurcation of the journalist role into celebrity, human person on one side, and the text being written by an AI on the other. I just wondered if you any response to that, just in a sense of this is happening like this morning.
I can maybe quick comment, I can pass it around. But this, I mean, the same thing happened with the writers' strike a couple of years ago in response to workers' jobs being threatened, and this is like a big labour movement topic, and I think we can learn a lot from the Luddites. Like the name has been pretty besmirched over the last decades, but that was also in a response to machines threatening their livelihoods and to reduce the Luddite movement a little bit too much, but to disrupt and destroy the machines. They weren't fearful of technology, but they were very aware of the power dynamics that happen in the way that they threaten our livelihoods. And I think a lot of writers are experiencing this right now, and so are artists, and as we all probably will be over the next few years, and being able to reckon with that at a labour movement level, I think would be really important.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a labour question and an intellectual property question and a whole cluster of things, but it also says, my gosh, like the affective power of disgust can be pretty strong. It's being registered in literary text, but it's also being organised within union movements, like a literal disgust at like this thing is not worthy.
Thank you for going like Dolly off through
I recently held a workshop with some playwrights, some recent graduates of NIDA, the National Institute of Dramatic Arts, and one of the guys doing that as well was on the board of the Australian Writers Guild. And yeah, people are terrified for their jobs, and I think, like rightly so, the evidence is there that jobs are going to be replaced. And yeah, short of destroying the machines, this is one of the things I do feel doomery about. I don't see anything that's going to stop it, other than that there will be a demand, right, for connection in some way. I guess there's 2 things that I wanted to just throw out there to think about. One is Matthew Kirschenbaum wrote a great piece about, can't now remember what it's called, in the Atlantic, about textpocalypse, right? Yeah. That this dynamic of automated writing is actually a continuation of something that has already been happening. And he points to, so for example, like spam emails and even SEO, like writing online has been increasingly automated for some time. Something he doesn't talk about, which is also relevant, is self-published books on Kindle. And The Verge had a great piece interviewing authors who do that and like the incredible Excel like schedules that they had for like how fast they had to tune out a book in order to make any kind of money from it. So it's an increase of a dynamic that was already at play. But then I just wanted to throw one other thing out there, which is I think, again, like from a theatrical perspective, the vision of the kind of sole creative author is already kind of problematic. But I think when people talk about kind of, and this is less relevant to the journalist, I think, and more to the kind of creative author kind of model, whenever someone talks about the kind of the creative author that ChatGPT will never rival, I think of like the Bloomsbury set. Do you know what I mean? I think of Virginia Woolf, or like these people who were incredible geniuses, but who had a life of privilege that allowed them to write in this kind of free way, you know? And so I just sort of, I'm trying to work out in my mind, like, where is this line that we're trying to kind of toe between acknowledging that writing has always been collective and supported by technology and changed by technology, and also like, yeah, saving jobs, right? Like saving people's livelihood. It's really complicated. Yeah.
I think that, sorry, did you? All right, just.
To an extent, aren't we talking about saving the sort of concept of humanity?
That's
maybe, although like I don't feel very human. So, you know, I'm part of this microphone, you know, I don't know, yeah.
Maybe that should be, why don't I set that as homework for the coffee break? So it's like whether you can decide whether humanity is being destroyed or not. But yeah, so thanks very much everyone who came up on stage. That was a really, really wide-ranging discussion and yeah, hopefully fascinating. So thank you. So we've got tea and coffee out in the kitchen and we're back at 11:30.